Martin, I've referenced the shit out of you as we've just been talking about. I'm so excited for this show. So thank you so much for joining me today.
No, I'm just delighted. Absolutely.
That is very kind of you. But I want to start with a little bit of context. So, you're at Andreessen today, and I want to start with, in your words, how did you make your way to be a GP at Andreessen today before we dive in?
Well, the quick story is I'm a failed physicist. So in undergrad, I did computational physics, worked at a national lab, decided that computer systems are much more accessible. And so I moved into systems, ended up doing a PhD at Stanford, started a company based on the research. Ben Horowitz joined my board. This is, by the way, this was in, I started the company in 2007. So 2008 was the Great Recession, almost went out of business. Marc and Ben saved the company. We ended up selling that about 4 years later to VMware. I ran that business for a while. And then, I decided that I'm super in love with innovation. I love startups. I love infrastructure and systems. I spent 10 years doing the operating thing, built $1 billion business, and it was time to kind of move to a different abstraction level. And so I joined, and I just focus on infrastructure at Andreessen Horowitz. So that is the crooked path I took.
Oh my God. You know what I love? There is this weird correlation between the more successful someone is, the shorter their intro is, and the least successful they are, the longer it is. And that was so succinct. I want to ask you, you mentioned the incredible operating career there. How do you think that operating career impacted your investor mindset today positively first?
So listen, I've had multiple boards. I've done 2 companies, and I've had multiple boards. And in my experience, you kind of have 3 types of board members. I think the mean board member, the average board member, they're investors. They've seen a lot of stuff. They'll roll up their sleeves. They'll help, recruit or whatever. But otherwise, they're just not close enough to product market fit to add much value. And so they'll say the things. They're polite. They're nice people. They're kind of net neutral, right? I think this is the average board member. I think, unfortunately, the next most common board member is the frustrated operator. And so they've kind of think they're an operator, maybe we're an exec in a large company, maybe had a small exit or whatever, and they really want to kind of backseat drive the company. And I've definitely dealt very directly with those, and they can be incredibly disruptive just because they don't realize that it's, it's not their company. And then, periodically you get like a pretty phenomenal board member. Like for me, that was Ben Horowitz, which, had a huge exit, spent 11 years, really kind of learning a craft, but also kind of getting it out of the system. And so I'll say a couple of things. On the investment side, I don't know if operating helps or not. Like, I don't know if it helps you pick. I don't know if it helps you close. I don't know. Like, I don't know how to answer that. Probably not. It probably hurts more than helps. But on the operating side, if you can realize it's not your own company, you end up having seen a lot of stuff and having a deep level of empathy that unless, like, basically, you had to pay payroll out of your bank account, which I had to do, unless you almost, shut down the company multiple times, which I had to do, unless you had to go begging for money about 50 times, like I had to do, unless you, almost sold a company and then didn't sell a company and almost get fired by your board, like I had to do, it's hard to have that kind of level of empathy and also just understanding. And so I think for that, it's useful, but I just want to caveat it. Like, hopefully you did your run and it's out of your system. Otherwise you can be disruptive.
I totally agree with you in terms of it kind of doing your run. Can I ask, I spoke to so many of your founders and partners before, and they said Martin is on so many boards. Yeah. How do you manage your board load, Martin?
Well, there's a few things to consider here. So the first one is like, I honestly don't know what VCs do with their days. I mean, it's just wild how many don't work in evenings or are gone on Fridays or don't work it's just unbelievable, over weekends. I just don't know what they do. I mean, if you step off of having listen, I grew a business from basically 0 to 600 million globally. I mean, I was working 100 hours a week and I was flying all over the place. And that's what I spent 10 years doing. And so it just turns out there's a ton of time in the week. So I think one thing is like, listen, I mean, if you put in the time, there's an awful lot of time in the day. And even if you're on a lot of boards, it's nothing compared to running, a 4,000 person team to hundreds of millions of run rate in my experience. The second thing is I'm very lucky at Andreessen Horowitz to work with basically the best junior partner team on the planet. Like many of them could be GPs at other firms, and they know their areas very, very well. And so they're tremendous help. And I literally couldn't do what I do without them. And so I think a lot of times I get credit unfairly for the work that my team did. Like for example, Jennifer Lee is way better than I am at, data, and Matt Bornstein's way better than I am at AI, right? And so I've just got this phenomenal team. And I'll say one more thing, which is, listen, I'm pretty good at recruiting. I've recruited a lot of people. I'm pretty good at sales. I've sold a lot of stuff. But I'm not nearly as good at recruiting as Jeff Stump, who's our executive recruiter. And I'm not really nearly as good at sales as Brad Kern. And listen, I've done a lot of marketing, but I'm not nearly as good at marketing at Market. And so I think part of the Andreessen model, which is so effective, is we really have like the industry best people that pitch in at stuff where often it's the GPs that are doing it. And so, I think it's a combination of, you work hard, like you, Harry. I mean, I don't think, listen, I've done a lot of podcasts. I've never in my life had somebody be so thorough. Like, you're just so clearly good at what you do, and you put in the fucking time, and like, it's what you should do. And you should work in evenings, and you should work on weekends. And if you don't, I just don't think you deserve to be investing in these companies. You just don't. And then you surround yourself with great, great people. And so, put in the time.
I have so many LPs, and they're like, we're worried about your time. And I'm like, I don't know what VCs do. I run a media company with many people and a venture. Fuck, like I need to learn golf is my lesson.
Okay, can I actually follow on that? 'Cause I love that. So here's another thing, which is what I do in my spare time. I'm just being very honest. My first love is infrastructure and systems. It sounds like a weird, nerdy thing to say, but I love it. I just absolutely love it. And I love how it intersects with finance, especially when it comes to the adoption of new technology and everything else. And so, I mean, for those of you listening, I even started a Discord with Tim Chen, and it's there's 1,200 people on there. And I'm there all the time, and we literally talk about infrastructure because this is what I want to do. And so, listen, if I wasn't, in a board meeting, I would be wanting to talk about this stuff anyways. And so I know so many VCs, right? I mean, I'm in the middle of the ecosystem, and you go and, you talk about a bunch of stuff, but it's almost never technology. It's almost never category creation. And it's almost never how do you position marketing. It's always like, oh, what's the new company? What's the new lead? Which I'm much, much less interested in that, and much, much more interested in what's going on. So I also just think that my interest levels are much more aligned with kind of what startups should be thinking about.
Can I ask, we mentioned time there and some elements of we don't know how venture investors do their time. Many of your founders asked this one, which was, where does Martin think the venture model is broken?
Well, here's a pretty interesting observation. I think it's actually twofold. So the first one is, the whole market for private capital and technology 2 decades ago was about a 50th the size it is now. A 50th. And the technology was much less mature, right? It was so much more fringe. And if you go forward to today, the market's enormous. And then I actually think you can view software technologies more like you'd view a mature industry, like say real estate or something, where you can be, a bit more thoughtful about the placing money. It's kind of less random in outcome, et cetera. And yet we have this model that we use for investing where it's, investors are basically generalists and they, deploy monies and they don't scale out and et cetera. That was born in this earlier year. I think that we can now think of venture much more like a mature market investment and, have portfolio synergies, scale up thesis, be very, very specialized and still be able to deploy a lot of money, have multiple products in venture, everything from seed through public through debt. I just think that listen, at the end of the day, I think that venture believes in innovation and we're very tech positive. And I think that we should be running Wall Street, not the finance people that don't believe in any of these things. So I think where venture is broken is it's time to grow up.
So what does that actually mean in reality? Because that was going to be one of my questions, because I've heard you say before that really the winners in venture are scale-ups, are the ones who scale. It's your Andreessens of the world who enjoy the benefits of scale. Why? And what does that mean for grow up for venture?
Let's. So I actually think it's not the winners that scale up. I actually think it's a barbell. I think that, either you're operating at scale and, you can help a company everywhere from seed through public. I think that's one end. And we'll talk about that because that's your specific question. I think, or there's a lot of alpha in relatively niche plays, right? Like you're just focused in a certain area or a certain stage and you build out operating around that. So I think both of those. So boutiques will continue to fare very, very well. And I think, the ones at scale will continue to do very, very well. I think it's in between where it's kind of a little bit more difficult because you've got pressure on either side of these. So what does it mean to scale up? So here's the way I think about it. If you're a founder building a company, you're going to need pools of capital, right? Mm-hmm. And today, the largest pools of capital either come from public markets, which they don't care about innovation, clearly, having been in a public company. They just want repeatable earnings. Or you can get it from large debt providers. They don't care about innovation. They just want to get their money back. Or you can get it from large financiers like private equity. They clearly don't care about innovation. They'd much rather fire people to get efficiencies than do innovation, right? And so eventually you graduate to pools of capital. They just don't care about innovation. And so, tech investing, VC has always been in the early stage where you're like, listen, we dream with the founders and we believe in, building new things and adding value. And then all of a sudden they quote unquote, finance, big, boys and girls come in and then basically say, okay, now everything's just a spreadsheet. And so I believe tech has matured to the point that you can scale tech innovative investing for the life cycle of a company. So why is it that these billions of dollars are being deployed by people that just honestly want to fire people for a living? I think.
What does that look like? Does that look like, tech innovation investors in public markets? Is that post going public?
Oh, I think it's everything. I mean, that's the whole point, right? It's like, it's the entire life cycle of a company. I think one way to think is step back. Think about the entire financial industry, everything from private equity to the big banks to venture capital, et cetera. And if you pull $1 at random from that pool, right? So it's quite likely that dollar is going to come from, a large bank or private equity or whatever. And what is their goal? Well, let me tell you, it's not innovation. It's just not, it's predictable returns, it's arbitrage, it's shorts, it's all this other stuff. And kind of the top of the value chain is this cohort of people that they're not interested in building companies and backing founders. It's funny. I mean, I remember speaking with a private equity person. I'm like, I was just talking to myself. I'm like, we're just having a conversation, idle conversation. If there's a public company and the founder's still running it, I'm bullish just because it's the founders, and founders can weather transitions and they can weather market transformations. Look at Reed Hastings, look at Jensen, founders are amazing. And this PE guy, it was I was speaking Greek. He's like, why do you care if the founder's running it? I'm like, it's the fucking founder, man. It's the person that made the magic to begin with. It's the person that has the credibility. That's everything. And so my point is here is, I want a future where if you pull $1 of random from finance, that dollar is given by somebody that believes innovation is good and believes in founding teams and believes that you can continue to scale capital deployment far beyond just Series C or whatever.
Can I dive in and kind of pose some alternative views, which is okay, if we think about financing a company seed to post IPO, one thing I don't like about having multi-stage investors where I'm on boards is the founders continuously having to sell. They don't bring the truth to the board with Martin because they want you to lead the next round as well. And so they continuously have to bring this veil of truth because they're selling for the next round whilst you're already in. How do you think about that and respond to that as a problem that you face?
Well, I think that would indicate a really broken relationship between the board member and the founder. So in all of these cases with multi-stages, the actual investor and board member is aligned to a fund. And so, for example, if you graduate from seed to venture, venture to growth, it's an entirely different team that's making a decision. And so the board member is very, very aligned with the founder when it comes to the next raise. And so, for example, I focus primarily on seeds, A's, and B's. Sometimes our growth fund decides that it does the deal, and I've been there pitching them too. So I'm very much aligned, because I think it's great when Andreessen goes in. And so I think a situation where the company is reliant on one person to make all of the decisions is not healthy. But certainly to have a partnership where they can have access to pools of capital through the life of the company is positive.
I get that, and I like that in terms of the segmented decision-making across vehicles. The next question that I have is, if we think about returns, we both know that small funds generate great returns. When you see this explosion of capital within these scale-up vehicles and going, as you said, through even to public markets, do you not worry that we're going to see the denigration of venture returns to PE-like returns with the maturation of the industry?
Well, I think this is just a bundling question, which is I think you create funds for different risk buckets and you provide LPs exposure to that. Like debt will never get the same return as equity, and early stage will never get the same as late stage. And so you've got just different variances on all of these. So the way, it's interesting, this is probably why, I would be a horrible financial investor, just horrible. It's I don't even really care strictly about thinking on returns. That's not what I maximize. I mean, here's the way that I view it, which is very simple, which is, listen, I strongly believe technology is a good. I think it solves problems. I think it adds value. I think it creates productivity. I mean, I think if you look at any graph on kind of human betterment, which is infant mortality or how long we live or, the number of diseases we have or whatever. I mean, this is just correlated with technical advancement. So I think, technology is a general good. Anybody that's building, technology that weathers the Darwinistic ecosystem of economics is going to be adding value. And so I view this asset class as investing in an index of the top innovators, in the world, and that's a very productive asset. And so my mental model is for anybody that wants exposure to the top software innovators in the world that are adding value, I want to provide an opportunity for them to have exposure to that, and I want to help those set of top innovators. Now, what happens specifically about the returns is a question on macro and all sorts of other stuff. But I guarantee a lot of value is going to accrue there. And historically, a ton of value is going to accrue there, right? And so I like to think at much more of an index across innovation and much less specifically about, you give me $1, I'm going to kind of make this $1 go up or down by exploiting every aspect that I can of a market.
I'm really just going for it, but you're very open and wonderful and human, so I'm going to be too. If there was a criticism, not criticism, but just a thought about some of your investing, it's that you're not so price sensitive, Martin. My question is, and you've paid some high prices. A question for you: do you think that's a fair summary, and how do you reflect on your own price sensitivity, given what you just said there?
Well, name it. Name ones where I wasn't price sensitive. So I think pretty much every single deal that I can recollect, I've been on the low end. The market's the market, but if you actually look at any independent investment that I do, I can't think of one. Maybe there is one, but I'm normally on the low end as far as prices that go in.
Is price a big factor in your consideration? Do you think you're price sensitive?
I think the market is the market. Meaning, but I want to be very honest. So I think people say things like this, but they either don't have data or they just don't know what they're talking about. So I would like to put you on the spot. Name a deal where it seems like I overpaid. So for example, I've never done any of these $1 billion Bs. I've never done, some strange non-competitive deal where it's an outsized price. Normally in any competitive deal that you've seen, I'm almost always on the low end. And so actually, I think if you went through the portfolio, your conclusion would be very, very different.
What was your entry price for DBT?
It was low. I mean, these aren't public numbers, so I can't talk about it, but it was quite low.
It was low. No,
I did the Series A.
Yeah, well done. Brad's round was less low.
Yeah, I mean, like, so no, I've done no. I think maybe people listen. A lot of people say a lot of things in this industry, and I tend to try and not focus. It's so funny how many rumors I hear about myself. It's like this constant set of rumors, which I tend to ignore. I will say, many of the companies I'm in have hit great prices. And I'm very, very happy for them to do it. That doesn't mean that I price them up. These are two very different things.
How do you think about your own investing style today? You, as we said, you've invested in, a generational, the last 5 years of an index of the best enterprise companies. Has your investing style changed over the years?
So my yeah, for sure. And my philosophy has changed a lot. Now, I'll tell you, it's going to sound really simple, but it's kind of the deepest truth that I've learned in this job. And again, it's going to sound really simple, but which is, I used to have the hubris to believe that if a company walked in, I could look at the company and I could determine if it's a good investment or not. And you think, well, of course you do. That's the job. And I've decided that's a totally underdetermined problem. And by underdetermined, there's just way more variables in equations, right? Like mathematically. And if any company walks in, I haven't a clue if it's a good investment or not, with a few exceptions. For example, I'm talking about the early stage here. The late stage, sure, or if it's a second-time founder, it's probably good, right? So like but first-time founder, new space, category creation, who knows, right? On the other hand, and this is this obvious unlock that I've had mentally. If I meet 5 companies, I can probably tell you which one of those 5 has a better chance than the others. Not to any level of certainty, but there's a bit of alpha there. There's a bit of judgment there. So I think that's a much more determined problem. And so I've stopped actually being in the oracle game. I just don't want to, in any given investment, listen, who am I to second guess these founders who are doing amazing things? I don't want to be in that position. And who am I to say something's not going to work? I don't want to be in that position. And so more and more, what I love to do is I just take a space and I just study the shit out of it. I just it's my favorite thing to do anyways. I'm going to do it anyways. I'm just going to fucking learn about databases and backends and front ends. And, that's what I did my PhD in and I love it. And that's what I'd be doing. And then for there, see which one of that cohort I think, is most in line with that. And I think that's actually a decidable problem.
So that's fascinating you say that, because I spoke to Angela Stranger on your team before. You mentioned that I spoke to many people. And she told me that the process that you go through is incredible for each kind of examination that you do. Is there a process that you engage in for each kind of examination? How do you approach a new topic and approach that learning and discovery phase?
Well, it's another big kind of learning, and I got this one from Chris Dixon, who I actually think is probably the most thoughtful investor on the planet. I really do, and probably the smartest. I think the founder network is just more intuitive and smarter and more prescient than any other network. And by that, I mean, if smart founders are going to do something, there's something probably interesting there, right? I don't care if VCs think it's interesting, and I don't care if analysts think it's interesting, and I don't care if Twitter thinks it's interesting. I care if smart founders think it's interesting. And so I look to see where founders are going. And if there are kind of a few of them, really smart ones, are looking at an area, then I get very interested in the area. And then, I do what I love. I'm an awkward, nerdy dude, right? I'm not I think a lot of VCs like to go out and network. I like to sit at home and chat on Discord about databases, right? And so and then I really like to try and understand what's going on. Now, one thing that is, I think, a product of my past is I'm much more interested in how technologies hit markets. How markets adopt them, how do you do category creation, how you do messaging. For example, when Ali Godsi, the CEO of Databricks, and I have dinner, we almost always just talk about category creation and building out go-to-market. From a technology standpoint, it's actually a very, very interesting problem. It's one that's not talked about enough. And so I just spend a lot of time trying to understand, how the market's evolving, what are the macro trends, who are the players, what's involved, et cetera. And I try and go very deep. And then based on that, then we try and make, decisions that we think are smart decisions in the space.
I mean, this is my job. You say, go-to-market applied to category creation isn't talked about enough. What do you think should be talked about within GTM and category creation that isn't being talked about?
Well, can you name a good resource for category creation?
No, not a centralized.
How about a decent one? Let me tell you, it's not Play Bigger.
No, I can't. I
mean,
mean,
where would you go read about category creation? Let's say you're a new infrastructure company like me. So listen, I was very, very heavily involved in the creation of software-defined network and network virtualization. I spent 10 years, I call it market annealing, just hammering the shit out of a market, just fucking beating on the market for years until it comes around. This is selling into an existing market's easy, man. The annealing you've got to do to soften up a market for categorization is hard. Where would you even start to read about that? Who?
I think
name a blog or a Twitter post or.
I think what I would advise is you learn from people who've done it before, and so
Exactly.
I would advise the one-to-one conversation and dialogue with someone who's done it before.
100%. It's just something that hasn't really hit. There is no crossing the chasm for category creation, really. For the types of technologies I'm interested in, it's as important as the product development, and it's as tricky and it's as hard and whatever. And so I just think it's a very, very interesting space.
How do you think about market timing with regards to category creation? Because the one thing that worries me is that the market can kind of continuously stay irrational for longer than a company can stay solvent, especially on the adoption side and the innovation side. And so how do you think about the importance of market timing?
It's kind of interesting. Have you ever played I'm going to go, what's going to sound like a tangent, but then I'm going to come back to your question, which is, have you ever played, Go, or do you know about the game Go?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the state space is so stupidly large that, you read these kind of books about Go, and there's these kind of cones, these almost aphorisms that are kind of very helpful, but none of them are very definitive. It's stay away from density, these things, which actually they turn to be very useful, but they're just, so I think that there's some cones that you can say about market timing that are useful. But again, I'm not trying to be definitive at all. I just want to make the point that the state space is so enormous and is so underdetermined, right? So a few things. So for one, I think working against a macro trend is just brutal. And so forget timing. It's listen, if a market is shrinking, if a trend is moving away from you, while there's still market and opportunity there, if the first derivative is negative, you're just in a really tough spot. Does that make sense? And so I would say, independent of specific timing, just make sure the second one is, there's varying degrees of market readiness, and I think this is just more correlated with the amount of effort that you as a startup need to do to establish yourself, right? So for example, if I am selling into an existing market with something that's 10 times faster, the timing question is not really a question. It's easier to sell. It ends up being kind of questions around churn and pricing pressure and stuff like that, right? Just because the category already exists. When it comes to category creation, I think that companies that really put in the time will carve out a niche. And then the question is more what's the staying power of the company, and how much money do you want to invest in the go-to-market death march of a new category? And you can, listen, I know of companies that through just absolutely sheer will built markets, and it wasn't timing, it was just sheer fucking will, but they spent a decade doing it. So I would say make sure you're trend aligned. Realize that if you're in a new market, the amount of work you're gonna have to do to kind of, again, I call it market annealing, but make the market pliable is gonna be commensurate with your speed, and then hopefully things unlock. But I believe you can death march to a public company without the market ever actually unlocking.
The thing that I think is fascinating is the state of storytelling state is, I think, pretty poor. And I think in market creation and category creation, it's more important than ever. How do you feel about the importance of storytelling on the founder perspective with regards to category creation?
So I think it's very, very important, and not just for educating the market, but even leading a team.
Yeah.
I would say the two best people on this, who both should write books, are McJanet and Steve Mullaney. So Dave McJanet is CEO of Hashi. Steve Mullaney, he's a CEO of Aviatrix. Both come from product marketing backgrounds. Both are iconic world-class CEOs. And what they'll tell you, which I think is exactly right, is, it's very important at some point in time to kick everybody out of the room, sit there for 3 days, and then write down the very lucid, very description vision of the company, like why it matters and what you're doing in a way that you deeply believe, in a way that outlines the future and outlines kind of the why together. It doesn't have to be the path, just the future. And then you use that to kind of drive everything about the company, from like recruiting to culture setting to, early sales to marketing to speaking to an analyst, et cetera. And so I do think that in early categories, it is just a crucial exercise to do.
Can I ask you, we sit and look at, many companies today, some in your portfolio, some not in your portfolio, creating amazing categories with incredible innovative technology. And with a change of funding environment, suddenly they're being told, cut burn, cut costs, and that naturally impacts one's ability to expel the mission, to tell stories through events, to really project the category forward. How do you advise them who are in the process of creating a category, but also being told to cut burn and reduce spend?
I don't think that these things are at odds. I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy. So
okay.
I would view it a little bit different. So let me tell you what I think is a mistake to do. Companies should be sized to the market opportunity and the funding environment, right? Otherwise, everybody loses their job and the company goes to zero, right? And so if the macro situation on this stuff changes, like the funding environment or you've got to right size the company in order to do that, just so the company can stay viable. And so what I see happen at large companies, and smaller companies are much better at this, which is great, but I think we can use large public companies as an example of what not to do, is often the first thing everybody says is let's freeze hiring. Yeah. So the problem with freezing hiring, it happens in large public companies, is you're basically out of the hiring market, and then normally performance management kind of goes out of the window. Because like every manager is like, we're not even backfilling a trip, so I'm not letting anybody go. Like I'm not moving people around. I'm not going to put this player into like another team where they'd be better served, right? And then you're also not adjusting the company relative to the needs of the market and the company. Like what if you have to like invest more in sales and less in R&D or something like that? You can't make those types of decisions. And so I think that if you have a market contraction, you need to decide, like, listen, like, is our existing operating plan, is that still viable in the current market? Because you can't control the macro. And if it's not, I would actually do a full replan to make sure that you can still operate like a company would. Just because the market shrunk 20% doesn't mean you don't have a company. It's just that your company now has to operate, you've got to cut somewhere. And it could just be spend. It could be all sorts of stuff. It doesn't have to be layoffs or rifts or anything like that. And so, again, I think you're going to have to do category creation regardless of cutting spend or not cutting spend. It's independent. I just think that you need to be very thoughtful when markets contract and capital contract about how you run your business.
How many of your companies have you had to do replans on?
Listen, I think in this market, if there's a company that's not doing a replan, they're probably negligent. Minimally. So normally in downturns, you move to scenario planning. And so the recommendation I'd give any founder is, if you see this much of a dramatic shift in the macro, you should sit down and you should create a median, bear, and bull case plan, and you should at least do the exercise. You don't have to enact it, but you should at least do the exercise.
Can I just dive in? What does a median, a bear, and a bull look like in terms of how you adjust dependent on each? I'm learning
right.
from
So no. This, it's just funny. It's been a long time since. So I cut my teeth in 2000. I started my company in 2007. A year in, 2008 happened, and I was like, oh shit, fucking nuclear winter, end of the world. I literally paid for like salary out of my bank account. Like I couldn't raise money. It was horrible. I had the same team of 10 people for 3 years. I just thought we were just, anyway. So I deeply appreciate and I empathize with what founders are going through on this. But I also think a lot of this skill set has been lost because it's been a long time since we've seen a reset this large. So what I'm saying is the following is, okay, so you created a plan probably, in Q4 of 2021, assuming some level of growth, right? Now, what I think companies should have done in Q2 is being like, oh shit, the world has changed. And, we may not be able to raise for, let's say 3 years, and, our top line might go down by 20%, and so now what do we do? And so what I would do is do a bear case of like, what do you think the maximum impact of the top line is going to be? And then as a result revenue. A median case, which is probably, normally you do kind of look at public companies or other cohorts to see how they're being impacted, and you do that for a median case, and then you do a bull case, which is like, let's assume, like nothing changes. Do we do the same thing, or is stuff like, are we going to be like recession accretive so that our business accelerates for whatever reason, and then you can do a bull plan? But at least you have to go to scenario planning, so you have done the exact work. So like if it turns out that like you totally whiff a quarter, like you do a 50% quarter, 40% quarter, you have everything planned out exactly how you'll respond to that. That's what I mean.
I totally get you. In terms of the response plan, I have a lot of founders say to me, layoffs, I hear that I need to do them, and I'm told, no, do them hard and do them once. But I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what the right amount is. How do you advise founders on like layoff strategies? And you've been through it in 2007, 2008, I'm sure. Like, how do you advise them on this challenge now?
So I tend to be very top down on these sorts of things. The goal is to keep the company solvent and successful, protect common and as many of the employees as possible. And so I think the right approach is to create an operating plan given the current economic environment, and ask the question is like, what is the right company in order to do that, given whatever risk profile that you're comfortable with as a board. And like, your boards are very different. Some boards are like, hey, listen, to hell with it, man, this is a time to build. Like, let's go ahead and accelerate into it. Like, I 100% work with companies that are like, this is amazing, fuck it, man, we're going to win. Like, it's like, hire, pull out the machetes, like, we're going to war type thing, right? So it's the level of response is all over, but like, you have to force discussion in the board. The board has to be aligned. I do think you have to do a top-down replanning of what is the right posture for the company, and then everything falls out of that. And it may or may not be layoffs. It could be all sorts of stuff, right? I mean, you could decide to like, reduce cloud contracts or whatever. But like, again, like the top-down plan is everything. I do definitely sit on boards, or I know board members where like they have these knee-jerk reactions of we have to cut by 40%, and you're like, why? So it's kind of funny. It's very funny if like an investor board member like tells a company, well, we have to cut by 40%. And then you're like, okay, well, why? It's not like they've like put together an operating plan, right? There's just like this kind of like number. And so I think everything needs to flow from an actual plan. So it's like at the same time, you're asking a founder to create an operating plan as well as like asking for a cut. It makes absolutely no sense. Like, come up with a plan, then figure out what's the right thing to do.
I want growth and I want cuts. Please. Right now. Thank you, Martin. Can I ask you mentioned that that board interaction. You have an incredible young team behind you and like working with you. In terms of your advice to young board members, how do you advise them, having been both founder and now obviously investor and board member with both? How do you advise them on being the best board member they can be?
I think the failure mode, and listen, I've made some mistakes early in my career for sure as a board member, and this is even prior to being an investor, right? Like after, I sold my company, a lot of people asked me to be an advisor and a board member, and I just dramatically overfit my experience, just dramatically early on, and that was a real mistake. And listen, like we all mature and grow, and that's something that I realized that I did. And what's kind of annoying about this is it used to drive me fucking nuts when other people did it to me. So I'd be like, I built this $1 billion business, like I had hundreds of millions when you say you overfit your experience, you mean you saw it in your company and you overlaid it on top of this company and thought it was the same? There's two, yeah, sorry. So there's two things that I did wrong that I see a lot of ex-operators do wrong as board members. One of them is I would provide guidance as if I was the one running the company. Mm. And I've got my own way of doing things, and it's, uniquely mine for all of its quirks and idiosyncrasies. And so, it's actually, this is a huge trap that investors can do. It's like, well, this is what I would do. Like, why aren't you doing this? Like, it's not their way. So that's one. And the second one is, listen, I happen to have a great experience, in the company that I built, but that's just one path. And so early on, I didn't have the deep board experience that I have now. And so I just kind of draw from that for my intuition. And so, I think the best junior board members that I know don't try to be helpful with advice. They try to be helpful by like doing stuff that only VCs can do and companies like can't do. So what I got my own team, I said, listen, don't tell them how to run their company. Like, don't tell them, a strategy around open source. Don't tell, like unless you really, really know, don't. What you should do is like you spend every fucking day researching the space, all the competitors, the people, like you've come up with a thesis. Like no founder has the time to do that. Like they don't have the time that you have just taking in meetings. Like, synthesize that information, provide them with data and input for making decisions, but like don't like try and tell them how you build a company with them. That's their job. And so having myself like had that but as a failure mode early on, like I do think that everybody could use this. And I do think it's worth noting that we always make fun of junior partners, which I think is a mistake. As an industry, we really undervalue junior VC partners. I think they're fantastic. They're hugely valuable. But we always make fun of them because like, oh, you're a PM in some crappy company or you're giving advice. I think that particular criticism is very valid. But what I think we do underappreciate is how much these people know about markets. It tends to be far more often than the founders and the companies themselves. And I think that that's something that if you're an early investor, you should just lean on.
I totally agree with you in terms of like the denigration of junior partners in a lot of ways. In terms of the junior partners, the team you have behind you, how do you make decisions as a team in your team? And how do you reflect on that? Is it good, bad? What could be improved?
Yeah. Did you ever read Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy Grove?
Yeah, totally.
One of my favorite takeaways. I've got so many like I've got so many kind of anecdotes on this specific question, and so I'm gonna give you two, and they're gonna sound a little bit tangential, but I actually believe this to be the case, which is when you've got massively complicated, underdetermined systems that consider a bunch of variables. Like, how do you systematically make a decision, right? Like, who fucking knows? I don't know. Nobody knows. So I think there's two people that I think said something very enlightening. One of them is Andy Grove. He basically says, for any hard decision, the only way you can get to the bottom of it is lots of vigorous debate. And I think he's dead right. Like, and you have to have it over days, like literally like days or weeks or months. And you haven't had that, like you're just being kind of reactive. Like you really need to explore this. And so, I'm so blessed to work with the best team on the planet. I'm so lucky to have this team. And like, basically all we do is talk about infra. Like that's what we talk about. And I think that over time, we end up with a pretty kind of even view on these types of things. And we actually tend to make decisions as a group. It's another thing I think for all of your listeners to understand. Junior partners have a lot of pull. It's not like, like I make decisions and they don't. Like they have a lot of pull. Sorry, you were gonna.
I have two questions for you. One, I agree with you in terms of the rigorous debate, but deals and great deals move fast. You don't have the luxury of having 2 weeks of debate time.
Great.
How do you deal with time compression?
Great. This is a great question. So, the majority of my time and my team's time is actually mapping out spaces. And so if a deal's going down very quickly and we don't jump on it, the number one reason is we just haven't done the work. This is why I appreciate you so much, Harry. I just so appreciate you and I so respect what you do, which is I think that the only thing you can't game in investing is the work. You can game anything else. You can game heat dynamics. You can game you can game everything. You can just game it, but you can't game like somebody doing the work and meeting with all the companies and understanding. And so like our method, it doesn't happen at deal time, typically.
Okay, so it doesn't happen at deal time. Got you. It happens then before. You then have to create a culture where they can say, Martin, I hear you. I know that you feel this way, but I disagree with you. It's hard to create a culture of safety when, bluntly, you are a very seasoned operator. You've seen it, done it before. How do you create an environment of safety where all young people can feel they can challenge you and have debate?
Well, the good news is I'm wrong all the time. So I think that helps, like being a very faulty human being that often, like literally is just wrong, constantly, I think is part of it. Here's another thing that I think that we actually got wrong early on in the firm that I think we fixed, which is early on junior partners were very, very junior and they'd kind of come and go and the tenure was 2 to 3 years. And so you didn't really have a common vernacular. And now a lot of the team members I work with, we've been working together for 4 years, and it's just a different level of communication, and a different level of trust. And so I think I've really enjoyed that. But, I will say it's probably something that I should watch because I can be pretty opinionated. And by the way, I don't think it's nearly as acute in venture as it is in operating. In operating, it's a real problem where you just kind of surround yourself with people that just basically agree with you all the time. And so, I think, listen, the bottom line is it's something that you need to be aware of. I mean, I think if you're actually having a discussion, then people need to have an opinion. Otherwise, there is no discussion. So if you force discussion, something will come out. I do think everybody, including myself, should keep this top of mind. I think it's a great question.
So I totally agree with you. And I if you don't have an opinion, you're fucking boring to me. I'm sorry. It sounds awful. Yeah, it's like, all right, you have no opinion? Oh, great. But my question to you is, how do you retain mental plasticity? Because I often have an opinion based on a historical data point, which could be front-end databases don't make money because no one fucking pays for them.
Yeah.
And it's wrong. Markets change, markets move. And so how do you retain plasticity with time?
Yeah. I think that, so there's this interesting question of like, do operators make good investors? I think that you got to rework a lot of brain damage on the operator side. I think that there's another interesting question is, do engineers make good investors? And I think, I think that this gets to the heart of your question, which is, I mean, listen, the first decade of my career, 20 to 30, I mean, I wrote papers and I wrote code. Like, that was 20 to 30, right? And when you're an engineer, especially in systems, like, I was like the blue collar type engineer, right? Like I like built systems. I didn't do theory or anything like that. And in systems, like you go through techniques that work. Like there's a few things that work, like caching works, like distributed consensus works. And you don't do things that have historically not worked. And so bad ideas, this is even on my Twitter thing, like bad ideas just tend to stay very bad. And so like you kind of just stick with a few good ideas. Like that's the method in systems. And that just doesn't work for investing. I mean, the reality is many companies that work end up, working, after 3 or 4 iterations. I mean, like Google very famously, the third iteration of search, Facebook, the third iteration of social networking. And I will tell you, my biggest lesson in this is just talking to Marc Andreessen. Listen, I've known Ben and Marc. They invested in my company. Like literally, how I met Ben is I tried to hire him as my CEO. When he left HP, he told me, he's like, I'm too rich. So I've known these guys for a long time, but like, to meet people that really dream about the future and really dream about technology and really care and like really believe and like are on the fringe and like whatever. I mean, I just think that that's the right view, is this kind of like positive futurism view, and not the curmudgeonly engineering view, which is I came from. And so,
okay, I'm just going for it now. I have a problem with the tourist VC, which are the ones that go to the events, do all the panels, put all the pictures on Twitter and LinkedIn. And like, I loved venture 12 years ago when I first saw it in the social network, which, like it or not, was my first exposure to it. But I just feel we have this like a different class of VC now, where it's not that love of innovation, where it's not that love of working, where it's more about being seen. Do you feel that same feeling that I do? Coming from the guy with the podcast, that's quite hilarious.
I actually don't. I actually think now VC is becoming very real. So, I hate to be the old guy, but like, when I raised money, every VC was like, show up late and like we're on their fucking phone, like all of them on their phone. They're all generalists. None of them were specialists really. They mostly had like random backgrounds. They didn't treat it like a discipline. I mean, it was like, like the classic sandhill, dude. There was always a dude at the time. And I think now there are people that you can talk to that really view this as like a a real discipline on the order of taking over all of finance. And they think about it in very, very structured ways. And they work incredibly hard and they understand the spaces very, very well. And I don't think that existed 15 years ago. It just didn't exist. And they really believe in value accrual to innovation and applying money to that problem. Now, that said, we're at the tail end of a decade-long bubble. So, of course, you've just got, a bunch of people that just want to get the spoils. And, of course, you run into them the most because they're the most flamboyant. But I think with this downturn, we'll see a lot of the tourists go away. And I think what will be left, I think that kind of cohort are very, very serious, very smart people that have realized something that just didn't exist 15 years ago. And for me, that's very, very exciting.
Can I ask, we've spoken about the scale-ups, we've spoken about kind of the changing nature of venture. Andreessen's changed so much as an institution in the time that you've been there, but especially over the last 24 months. What have been the best change? And what's been the worst change?
Well, I think scaling anything is hard, whether that's a distributed system or an organization. I will say scale is an unsolved problem in venture capital. It's a solved problem in finance because you don't have conflicts. Every asset's fungible. And so I think the best change is each independent investing arm has become very, very empowered, which I think is fantastic. So for example, bio or crypto or the venture fund or whatever, the operations have been decoupled so we can really, really focus on the areas and kind of build a platform that's more relevant to that area. So I think that's very positive. I suspect you're going to say what's the worst, and so just to preempt that question very quickly, it's scale is hard, right? And so it just takes a while when you change operating model, to go to distributed, to actually smooth that out. Now, I feel like we've done a phenomenal job, having been through a bunch of big company reorgs. We've done a phenomenal job.
What things break with scale? Culture, communication, decision-making, that's most prominent to you, do you think?
I think in this case, it was... it was just basic, simple stuff, like who do you ask to do certain things? It's just basic process stuff. And then you just need to, it's just, it's actually much more banal than I think people would assume. Where you're like, oh, now we've got we've got independent teams. So where does P&L sit? And how do you do budget allocation? It's basic stuff like that. But it does slow everything down once you're kind of hammering out those details.
How could you improve as a leader of a team today?
Oh, in a million ways. Are you kidding?
What's the one where you're sitting at the dinner?
What kind of team do you mean? Like
an investing team. So you think you run your team today, and you're like, you know what? I don't give them enough room to speak. I'm not present enough. I'm whatever that is. Where are you as a leader today?
Well, all of those, all of those for sure. Listen, I'm a deeply, deeply flawed human being, right? And we can all do a lot of growth. I'll say here is one that I think that the industry and myself could be better of, which is, I think I get a lot more credit than is due. I think my team is so phenomenal, and it's kind of interesting though, because we'll do a deal and we'll do a lot of work on a space, and then often I'll be the one that's credited with it when listen, I was involved and invested in etc. But I certainly wasn't the primary backer, and so I think this really matters to people's careers. I also think it matters to for people to understand actually where the value is coming from. And so this is something that I've been working on, is making sure that we're just a lot more equitable in general, as far as I think that the a16z infra team is, a phenomenal team, and I like it much more as the a16z infra team than a Martin Casado anything. And I just think that that's actually more reflective of reality. And so that's one area.
How do you advise investors, young investors today, going through an abyss? It happens in investing careers where you have one not so good investment, two not so good investment, and then you're going, fuck, am I any good at this? And actually you really lose confidence. How do you advise investors on going through the abyss? And is there a difference between those that make it and those that don't?
So I think this entire job is literally about controlling the things that you can control, but being very, very clear about what those are. And I do feel when I talk with a lot of investors that they're just kind of winging it. And I think that's a huge mistake. And so I think you need to come up with basically what is your belief as far as investing. Like that's the first thing you do. And then realize that there's two main challenges as an investor. The first one is like getting emotion out of it, which is really fucking hard, man. Like, dude, I'm Latin. Like, I'm as emotional as it gets, right? I'm half Spanish, half Italian. I just want to and so I, when it comes to follow-on decisions, when it comes to it's very easy to fall in love and so getting emotion out is very hard. So that's one thing that, you've got to find a way to do. And the second one, you need to realize that there's a real principal agent problem in investing, and it's not even conscious. It's like if you have a team or whatever, people are going to subconsciously do what's best for their careers or whatever. And so here's the way that I think about it. So the first is you need to come up with an approach that you believe in. So in my case, I think the right thing to do is just to focus on top companies, index, interesting spaces where the founders have gone to the space. That's it. And then I don't try and overthink any independent investment. I just say does the thesis hold? Historically has the thesis hold? And whatever. And then I always measure myself relative to that approach. And then I do my best to make sure that we're not falling trap to kind of emotional issues and principal agents. And then other than that, there's not much you can do.
Do you worry about confirmation bias? So you have a thesis, you've done your work, and you see this going this way, and then you find something that aligns to that thesis and you back it. A lot of times your thesis might just be wrong.
Yeah, no. That's why I definitely try not to do. So it's kind of funny. At a16z, a lot of people talk about actually not just a16z. A lot of investors talk about thesis. I don't think that's the right way to think about investing at all. I think it's just so crazy to come up with some story, which to your point is retrofitted. So I'm definitely not a thesis investor in that sense. Here's my thesis. It's very simple. Founders are smarter than I am.
What are you, a space identifier? Help me.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the principal value is understanding the spaces, which, by the way, is led by the founders, not by me. I don't want to identify. Listen, I don't feel like I'm smarter than any founder out there. I just don't. I think they're smarter, right? I do think that I can have a broader view than they have because I can meet more people and I have a team that can do the diligence and call in the customers, right? And so the selection is between a set of, of a given space who I think is a leading company in that space. It's really that. But that's not a thesis, right? A thesis is some grand unified theory of how the back end and this and that and whatever. I don't do any of that stuff. I just think that it's just too easy to spin a narrative for yourself.
Speaking kind of a narrative for yourself, I do want to touch on kind of a narrative for venture looking forwards before we do a quick fire. When you look forward, we've spoken about kind of venture ecosystem, what could be changed. When you look forward, we're in 2032 now. You're, the sprightly age of whatever, 34. Very young, good face moisturizer. Yeah, there we go. What does the venture ecosystem look like then in 10 years?
I mean, I think we're heading to honestly what I said, which is I think there's going to be a question of if there's $1 deployed in the future, is that dollar going to fund innovation, or is it going to basically get predictable returns and basically stifle innovation? And I hope it's going to fund innovation. I mean, the bulk of the dollars are just not. If you think about it, the bulk of the dollars literally are so you can fucking fire people and get better operating margin or whatever, or you get predictable returns or whatever. That's what the majority of dollars are for, and it makes sense for 401ks and stuff like that. But I just think that now technology is mature enough that you can invest in innovation and get predictable returns. It's a fundamental belief of mine, and so I hope that in 10 years that venture looks a lot more like traditional finance.
Does that displace traditional finance?
Sure, but not in. I mean, listen. It never makes sense to speak categorically about anything, right? I don't believe in zero-sum games. I think the market's expanding. I think that it definitely moves it into. I think it erodes its hold on, companies earlier in their life cycle. But that includes public companies because there's so much value that has accrued to companies after they've gone public, right? I mean, it just makes sense that pro-innovation capital should be available to them. And so displace, no, categorically, clearly not. take some of the territory that it currently has? Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I think it's capital shifts on LPs budgets, which is, traditionally venture is, it used to be like 8%. Now it's like 20%. I'm seeing in some endowments it's like 35, where that's overweight. But I totally agree in terms of capital shifts. I want to move into a quick fire, Martin. So I say a short statement. You give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, give it a shot. Yeah.
So what's your favorite book and why?
I'm so bad with favorite questions, but I just read The Weirdest People in the World, and it's the most remarkable book ever. And the reason
Why?
it's a reminder of two things: that really brains are hardware and software, and the software really matters. And in the case of this book, the thesis of this book is just basically like Western Protestantism. Is that thought pattern has physiologically changed humans, and is one of the reasons that that the Western world is more pro-social, like willing to work with strangers to solve hard problems. It's just a remarkable statement. And one of the reasons underlying it, one of the reasons that it's not just kin-based, like we don't just stick with our clan, but we actually work with strangers to solve kind of broader ideals, is because there's high-level abstractions there that we kind of glom onto, like universal good and stuff like that. And so it just shows you how powerful, brain software can be.
What's your biggest lesson from your time with Marc?
My biggest lesson from my time with Marc?
Yeah.
Oh, it's what I mentioned. It's just I think so often like morality comes down to the aesthetics, and I'm in love with the aesthetic that technology is a real good, and we're making the world a better place, and the future is bright on that, and it's a great way to spend time and effort.
What do you believe that most around you disbelieve, Martin?
A lot of stuff. A lot of what I've said, now people start to believe, but it was very, very controversial when I said that, I think that the cloud is breaking beyond its borders, which I absolutely believe. I think the cloud is disaggregating. A lot of people disbelieve that.
What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you started at Andreessen?
Well, the things that I talked about, I think I would have... Listen, my bedside manner has improved an awful lot as a board member, and I think that my expectations on how smart a venture capitalist can be have also been tempered, and a lot of the hubris is gone. And so, listen, life would have been easier if I didn't have to take the hard path that way. But
what did you make of the crossover fund activity over the last few years?
I think it was actually brilliant. I think that was a very, very smart model, and it's the right one. I think it's very hard for finance people to deploy money effectively at the early stage, but I think it's the right model if you can actually understand the markets. And so it's like the right model, kind of the wrong people doing it.
What's your biggest miss, and how did it impact your mindset?
I've missed so many, and they're all huge. I've missed so many. I miss whole areas, right? Like we don't even have a bet in cloud security posture management, right? Like the Laceworks and the Orcas and the Wizzes, right? And so, but here's my biggest takeaway is we still have the starvation mentality of the early 2000s of the market's limited, we should only deploy a little bit of money, blah, blah, blah. The reality is you can't deploy money fast enough in the current market, even with the downturn, and there's more opportunity out there, and it's bigger than any of us know about it, and it's time that we all kind of mature and believe that.
What's the best investment advice you've received? So mine is, this too shall pass.
I don't know. Trust founders. Follow the founder network is probably the best advice I've ever.
Who's the most underrated angel in the ecosystem for you?
Ram Sriram.
Ram Shriram?
Mm-hmm.
Wait, where's he?
He's got Sherpalo Capital. He's on the board of Google and Amazon, and people know. Yeah. Let me tell you why I say Ram Sriram. There's a bunch of great angel investors out there. Listen, the guy's a billionaire. He's super famous, and there's a lot of these super famous, billionaire guys out there, right there. That Ram works so hard and adds so much value to the boards that he's on. It's just unbelievable. And it's just so rare that someone of that, stature and fame contributes so much. And so I know it's a non-tradition. It's not what you were expecting as far, but like he really is something else. I really owe a lot to the guy.
Martin, as the most underrated, it's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. Final one for you, though. Yeah. What's your most recent publicly announced investment, and why did you get so excited?
I actually don't even know. I honestly don't know the answer to the most recent one. Do you know?
I don't know. I can answer it for myself, let alone for you. That's the joy of what I do. I couldn't answer most of my own questions. But I totally get. Okay, give me another one. Martin Casado in 10 years. Where do you want to be?
I would love to continue to focus on how, West Coast product focused, founder focused investment can continue to erode at East Coast finance, and I would love to continue to be playing a part of that.
Martin, I have never quite had a guest who swears as much as me. I loved it. It's a thrill for me. You could be British deep down. I love it. Thank you so much for doing this, and it was so much fun.
Harry. Thank you so much, Harry.